The Crossroads of History. When everything happens at once. This is a presentation by Charles Goyette, co-author of the new book, The Last Gold Rush Ever. And now, The Crossroads of History. Here's Charles Goyette.
It's called The Last Gold Rush Ever, and there's a certain amount of peril in naming a book that, because people automatically think it has something to do with, gold mining and prospecting and things like that. And I assure you, it doesn't have anything to do with any of those things. But we thought it was an appropriate title because, we having seen in our lifetimes people standing on the street corners and around the block waiting to buy gold, and that happened in the Carter administration. We had a similar sort of event for different reasons in Germany fairly recently. We're looking for an event that will be very much like that, in which people will be standing in line to buy gold, and it will be the last of these kinds of gold rushes in the dollar as it's presently configured. And as you know, in the last actually less than 100 years, we've had three different forms of the US dollar. And most Americans don't pay any attention to this thing, and they don't give much thought to what gives green pieces of paper or digital currency that shows up in your bank account, what gives it value. But we have had three forms of the US dollar. We had the gold dollar, which was a warehouse receipt for gold that you could get from the Treasury or your bank at any time. Then we had the gold exchange system. It's too bad if you were an American, but if you were a foreigner, you could wait in line and hope to exchange your dollars, your US dollars for gold. And now we're on the weakest of the three systems. And it is coming to a perilously near close soon to a theater near you. And that is just the pure dollar standard, which is not backed by anything, has no representation of being backed by anything. So it's a different kind of gold rush. It's not the kind that you would normally expect. And of course, I have this problem with PR people and book jobbers and stackers and things like that, who would automatically think that this is about, prospecting and so on. And those who don't think that then think it's like an investing book. I have a new theory of how to trade PE ratios to maximize your profits in 2 weeks on the stock market, or about ETFs, or about how to get advantage of the bond market and commodity trading and things like that. And they all kind of pigeonhole at that, but it's really not that. It's really about we've come to a crossroads in history here. We're at a crossroads in which everything happens at once. So it's a crossroads that the future of civilization itself, at least Western civilization, that form of civilization, is very much on the line. The future of the United States government, its ability to pay its bills, its ability to pay its debts, the willingness of foreigners to keep funding our debts, the willingness of people to accept the US dollars as presently configured all over the world, to fund our empire, to fund our wars by funding our debt. All of these things are coming to a head now. And that is the book that we have written here. So there have been other gold markets, we call them secular gold markets, the other challenges to the monetary system, and they have been characterized typically by monetary inflation, by exuberant money printing by the Federal Reserve, and of course by debt. So this is where we start, and we set the stage, these 7 reasons, we set the stage for the last gold rush ever, with those 2 elements that are common to the prior gold bull markets. We start with the Federal Reserve itself, the people that we call the Deep State Money Manipulators, and then we talk about the debt and debt binging, and move on from there. David Stockman, in his great introduction to it, says he identifies what we have done with the book, that we have written not only set the stage with the backstory of the debt as it is today, the backstory of the Fed's policies as they are today, and what they have done that will have to be assimilated. But in addition to that, we've got 5 other things among the 7 that we talk about that we call accelerators. So when the fire investigators go to investigate the arson, they look at the structure itself. It's particle board, it's wood, it's this, that, it burns this fast, this hot, and so on and so forth. But then they go and look for the accelerators, the things that moved the fire, that somebody used to spread it, and so on. And that is what the other 5 elements of our story are about. So we've written about We've written about the deep state money manipulators, the Federal Reserve. We've written about the debt in some new and interesting ways. And then we've written about these events that are all converging, this malevolent convergence of events that are all taking place now that will, well, in Stockman's words, it's, you've got the Fed and fiscal policy have poured kerosene on the fire, but he thinks these other events are additional accelerants that will make this bonfire of calamities burn hotter and the gold price run higher than people that don't read the book would ever imagine. So I think the best thing that I can do is just to spend a minute or two on each section without going into any detail. Just pick an item or an anecdote or something from each of these sections that may be somehow illuminating and otherwise interesting and perhaps even intriguing enough to get you to want to buy the book. And so I'd like to start with the Federal Reserve, the group that we call the Deep State Money Manipulators. And there is a reason that it is called the Federal Reserve System. And it's called the Federal Reserve System for very clever reasons, very sound reasons in the views of the originators of this banking cartel. They wanted to call it federal to invoke the power of the national government, the might of the short state. They wanted to call it a system because Americans have an antipathy to central banks. It was more pronounced then, of course, than it is now. So they didn't want to call it the Federal Reserve Bank. They call it a system instead. So they've invoked the government and its size and might, and they've invoked a system rather than a bank. But they called it a reserve system for a specific reason. And that was that, characterized by occasional panics and bank runs and so on, the idea behind the Federal Reserve System was that all the member banks in the United States would pool a certain portion of their deposits with the Fed that would be held as a reserve against things like bank runs, so that if there was a regional bank run in one area, the Fed would be able to step in and make it whole. The might of the federal government would calm everybody down. The bank run would come to an end before it spread. So it was called a reserve system for that reason, that the reserve was fundamental to its inception, and it was used to sell the American people who had been through the panic of, 1905 and so on. It was used to sell the American people on the Fed itself. But a very funny thing happened just a couple of months ago after the COVID outbreak. And although I follow these events very, very closely, I am surprised that there is almost no discussion about this. But suddenly, back about, I think it was in May, the current head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, announced that from this day forward, banks would no longer be required to keep a reserve with the Fed. They bulldozed the whole rationale, the whole infrastructure for the creation of the Fed to begin with. Got rid of it just like that. So now there are no required reserves. Another category of assets called reserves of the Fed that are not required grew by leaps and bounds because the required reserve component disappeared. The money got shoved into another category that the banks could lend without regard to a reserve with the Fed whatsoever. It's a fundamental change. And the idea, of course, is the kind of thing that you would expect when a country or a central bank is stepping on the accelerator, when they're really getting ready to put the printing presses in overdrive. They removed the reserve requirement entirely and then undid the rationale for the Fed from the beginning. But the whole rationale has disappeared down the memory hole, and nobody talks about what a fundamental change this is. So we described that. We discussed that at a little bit of length in the first section about the deep state money manipulators. You know, the deep state, as we all know in this day and age now, has finally entered the vocabulary of people. It's funny that you have a Nobel Peace Prize candidate and you get more wars. You know, you have you elect fiscal conservatives to Congress and you get more spending. And the reason is, as we discern it, is that the perpetual government, the invisible government, the background government, the career government, goes on regardless of what those elected to power seem to want to do. And that is the case with the Federal Reserve. It is clearly the deep state hiding in plain sight. And if you think partisanship divides Americans, it certainly doesn't divide them about monetary policy or about the Federal Reserve. I was thinking about this just the other day. If you remember, the longest serving chairman of the Fed was Alan Greenspan. I think he served 4 or 5 terms. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan. He was appointed by Bush the Elder. He was reappointed by Bill Clinton, a Democrat. He was appointed again by Bill Clinton, a Democrat. And then he was appointed again by George W. Bush, a Republican. So much for, a partisan and philosophical division between the parties. The monetary policy stays pretty much the same under, and the same was true of Ben Bernanke, who was appointed originally by George W. Bush and then reappointed by Barack Obama. So they're the deep state money manipulators, and you ignore what they are doing, things like removing the reserve requirement or the massive flood of monetary creation that they have been involved in the last few years. In fact, since the housing meltdown, you ignore all of that at your peril. But quite simply, they have purchased assets with money that they created out of thin air just in the last year in the order of more than $3 trillion. And this is money that in the past, they have been able sometimes to keep it in shrink wrap in the basement of the Eccles building in Washington, and it hasn't entered the general economy. This is all changing now, especially with the elimination of the reserve requirement. So the next chapter, the fundamental chapters, the 2 background stories, is the one about the debt and the way that the federal government has binged on debt. I use that chapter, Bill and I use that chapter to make a little fun of the governing classes and what I guess we could call, quite frankly, their economic imbecility. And it's certainly bipartisan or it's nonpartisan. But when Trump was running for office, he said, "Well, when I'm elected, what we're going to do is we're going to renegotiate the U.S. debt." Now maybe you can do that if you're a bad real estate developer or you're not used to paying your subcontractors or your contractors stuff. You're used to junk bonds and things. You can renegotiate that debt, but it has a whole different impact when you're talking about the sovereign debt of the United States. And the establishment, conservative and liberals alike, went nuts. They went mad. And they just started, the dogs were baying and nipping at his heels on the campaign trail for a couple of weeks. And he couldn't call them off. And then he started saying, "Well, yeah, but I'm the king of debt and I know how to renegotiate the debt." And the Wall Street Journal said, "Well, what are you talking about? You're going to issue new bonds at higher interest rates to pay off the existing bonds at lower interest rates. What are you talking about?" And others said, there's a lot of loose talk going on about things by people who clearly don't know what they're talking about. And it is true. So finally, Trump said the magic words. He said, "Well, I hate to tell you, none of this really matters because we just print the money anyway." And that shut them all, that stopped it. That ended it called off the dogs, and that was the last he had to worry about it. But Michael Kinsley said when Trump talked about, we don't have a country if we don't do something about the debt, he had committed a gaffe in the minds of the establishment press. You can't talk like that. You can't talk about sovereign debt being at risk. It's a gaffe. So he committed another gaffe and said, we just print the money anyway. That's, so a gaffe is when a politician utters the truth in public. So we go into great detail and with some, I think, illuminating charts and some original observations about the nature of the debt and the debt binging. But all of this is the infrastructure that goes up in general conflagration. And there are accelerants for this last gold rush ever. And I'll just touch on as a few of them just to get in the time that I have remaining. One of them has to do with the trade war. Donald Trump is a veteran trade warrior, as are many people in Washington. And he came into office saying, and this is a literal quote, tariffs, I want tariffs. And when people try to negotiate deals without tariffs, "No, I don't want that. I want tariffs. I want tariffs," and so on. So many of you may know Don Boudreaux, who is at George Mason, professor of economics, and he writes open letters to different public figures who say things about the public debate that don't make any sense. And we republished one in our book in the chapter about trade and currency wars that I think summed up a lot of what we have to say about the currency wars. And it goes like this. It was a response to Wilbur Ross, I guess he was the Commerce Secretary, and he was to the Wall Street Journal, and he said in response to Wilbur Ross writing about foreign governments dumping goods, Boudreaux said, editor, first, because imported goods are inanimate and they come to America only because Americans choose to buy them, the administration's fight is not against the goods themselves, rather it's against the flesh and blood Americans who voluntarily purchase the goods. As is true of all trade restrictions, this one at root is a restriction on the freedom of domestic citizens to maximize the values of their incomes. Second, he writes, this Trumpian fight against dumping reveals the ignorance and inconsistency of Ross and others in Trump's troop of economic nationalists. If the Chinese are really selling aluminum to us Americans at excessively low prices, then the Chinese are voluntarily redistributing wealth from themselves to us. They're giving us a gift. Therefore, a lieutenant of someone who famously wants to make America great again and who worries that American wealth is draining into China and other foreign countries should certainly applaud Chinese dumping. That person should agitate not to end the dumping, but to increase it. And yet Ross does just the opposite, a fact that implies that he is either hopelessly ignorant or dangerously disingenuous. We describe the manipulation of currencies and the race to the bottom of currencies as another accelerant that will undermine the United States dollar and other currencies and drive people to the last gold rush ever. A second, or in this case, another element that we call an accelerant is the war on cash. Somebody should write a book based on our chapter on the war on cash. There's more material here than you could shake a stick at. And it is accelerated too. The war on cash has been kind of a nuisance for people at pawn shops or gold dealers, even automobile dealers. You know, there are reporting requirements on cash. There are things like charges of somebody structuring. So if you violate the $10,000 cash limits that the federal government has imposed on the bank by taking out or depositing money that adds up to that amount over time, you can be accused of structuring your transactions to avoid the law, and you're guilty if you do that. There are other components, like the banks are required to file suspicious activity reports on people for their cash recommendations. But I wanted to focus on something else, and I did at the end of the chapter, and that is a real fundamental question that should be important to libertarians and in fact important to all Americans. The war on cash is being led up intellectually by people like Larry Summers and Kenneth Rogoff, formerly at the IMF. They're both I guess still at Harvard. Rogoff has even written a book called The Curse of Cash. But what they suggest for Americans, they suggest that the government make the use of money as inconvenient as possible. They want the government to burden the people. They want the government to make heavy coinage that is lumpy and difficult to carry, so that it will drive people, of course, to institutionalize all of their money. And of course, if you have in mind a zero interest rate regime, it's much easier to implement if all money, all cash, all wealth is institutionalized under the watchful eye of the federal government, rather than people trading in cash as they will. This to me brings up an age-old philosophical question that I posed in the book. There are a lot more elements to the war on cash. The intent of the money manipulators to use the elimination of cash as a way of transmitting monetary policy instantly to the marketplace through the banks, where all of your wealth and all of everybody's wealth is. There is a control of social dissidence, which is a looming threat. It's an actual threat in places like China. It's a growing threat here in the United States. So it has all those other purposes, but it has one that shows us the order, the hierarchy of rights in the view of people like Summers and Rogoff, and it is this: if they want the money to inconvenience the people, you have to ask yourself the age-old question that actually Jesus asked this question when he was accused of healing on the Sabbath. He said, well, is the Sabbath created to serve people, or people created like ants in an anthill? Really, he's saying, are people created to serve the Sabbath? Who is subordinate to what? So if the monetary system of the state is used to control and inconvenience the people, are the people the subjects, the subordinates of the state, to be used for the greater glory of the state? Have we gone so far now that we understand that the state is not to be our servant, to protect our rights and so on, but it can inconvenience us to drive us to social behavior that it wishes? We talk about the de-dollarization in one chapter, a chapter about the New World Order, and describe the movement of bank reserves that were once held in dollars, the movement of those bank reserves into gold at other central banks. And the truth is that the central banks of the world don't mind fleecing their own people and their own citizens with their fraudulent money, with their fiat money. They just don't want to be victimized by ours. This is a key. This is one of the most important financial movements in the world today. It's a de-dollarization movement, and it's visible in the central bank reserves that were once held in dollars. We talk about banana republic economics, the spread of socialism. I think this is visible for everybody to see. The way that the deep state, the federal government, the Federal Reserve are used to benefit certain cronies goes back in this country to the Gilded Age, when the railroads were the beneficiaries of state power, and as a result, we're able to accumulate monstrous amounts of wealth, because normally prosperity and profit brings in other entrepreneurs who see opportunities, but they were foreclosed from doing so by, for example, grants of rights of way, monopolies on routes, monopolies on prices, monopolies on routes, monopolies on ticket prices, and so on. Well, we have the same thing going on today. We have a new sort of cronies. The cronies in the 50s were the fruit companies that were able to use the State Department and the CIA to topple entire governments in places like Central America, or matter of fact, in Iran. Today, the cronies of the state are really the military, industrial, national security, high-tech surveillance industry. And we write about that. And finally, we talk about the end of the empire. The reach of the dollar, the power of the dollar, is coextensive with the American military empire. And they will fall as one. And we have some interesting research in there about the inclination of people in the state to create wars where wars are not necessary. And I'll just take one talking point and close with that. The greatest talking point, which meets with universal approval in Washington, approval on both sides of the aisle today, is of course this business about the rise of China and the threat of China, and the need for the United States to expend its military might, keeping the sea lanes open in the South China Sea. All of this is a consequence of the economic growth of China. If we didn't want the Chinese people and their billions to be free and to be able to move to economic prosperity, we shouldn't have ever, had policies that directed them that way, or tried to suggest to them that was a good thing. We should have left them under the tender mercies of Mao rather than Deng Xiaoping, and encourage them to stay a National Socialist or Communist state. But they did not in many ways, and so they have grown. It's been a remarkable act of economic growth. But 75% of the shipping now is inevitable with their growth, with their economic might, with their demand, with their production. 75% of the shipping in the South China Sea now comes and goes from China. Well, who has an interest in keeping those sea lanes open? We, from half a world away, or the Chinese? Because if those sea lanes are closed, the Chinese government is finished. It is finished. It cannot support its civilian population in the urban centers with jobs if the sea lanes close. So, and by the way, and there's precedent for the fact that that commerce continues. Even suppose that the Chinese, in some perverse act, decided to close the South China Sea lanes to us. What is the impact on us? Well, we have a couple of precedents. We have the OPEC oil embargo. Now, it wasn't exactly the closing of the sea lanes, but we had to see, but petroleum had to come from other places than the normal and usual routes. And we cite the evidence and what the cost of that was to gross national product of the countries affected. But even better was the closing of the Suez Canal during the 6-Day War and then for 8 years. And that diverted an enormous amount of shipping to Europe and to other places. And it's possible to compute the impact, the cost of having to take those detours for goods that couldn't now go the shortcut through the Suez Canal. And you will not be surprised to know, because you are a thoughtful audience, that the cost of detouring goods for 8 long years was a small fraction of the cost of having gone to war to keep those sea lanes open. So we finish with the story about the ending of the empire. When countries see their empire, their hegemony squeezed, when Mike Pompeo runs around the world ordering sanctions on people and ordering other countries to obey us and stuff, and they don't do it, the empire naturally, typically becomes more aggressive, and it looks to beef up, to fortify, and to even assert its military might as a response to this defiance. Well, we must not be strong enough. We need more armaments, more money, bigger budgets, be a bigger threat. And this is done, this imperial overstretch is done at the expense of the domestic economy. And this is an age-old pattern. I mean, even Gibbons talks about it in The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. They collapsed because of their own overreach. That is another accelerant of the last gold rush ever, and it is a reason that we distinguish this book and this account of where we are headed, where the dollar is headed, where the global economy is headed, from all other prior secular gold bull markets. This one is vastly different. Not only is the debt story, the fiat money story, hugely out of proportion of anything that has ever come before. Not only that, but there are all these accelerants hovering around at the same time, all casting shadows before them. The end of the American empire is certainly one of the greatest. So that is our book. We hope that you will buy it and read it. It's available on Amazon.com.
The Last Gold Rush Ever by Charles Goyette and Bill Haynes.